It started before the sun had fully risen, when the quiet street was still wrapped in that soft early morning silence, the kind of silence Jake loved most. He opened his front door expecting birds and the smell of wet grass, but instead he was hit by the roar of diesel engines, the crunch of tires, and the hard metallic clash of shovels hitting asphalt. He squinted against the rising sun and saw a line of HOA trucks blocking the only road that led in or out of the neighborhood. Workers in bright orange vests were already tearing into the street like it belonged to them, digging wide, deep trenches with loud machines and pushing piles of broken asphalt to the sides. It looked less like road maintenance and more like a full demolition site. Karen stood right in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on. A grin stretched across her face like she was the queen of the block. She pointed here, barked there, waving her arms with authority she didn't really have. The sound of her voice rose above the machines as she snapped orders at the crew. "No, no, dig deeper here," she shouted. "We need this whole section out by noon." The workers obeyed without question, tearing more and more of the road apart. There were no cones set up, no detours, no warning signs. Just chaos. Jake stepped out farther, his boots crunching on loose gravel, his eyes tracing the length of the road. It was worse than he first thought. They weren't just patching up a crack. They were ripping out the entire center stretch of the street, the one road that everyone used every single day. Trucks were parked at both ends, completely blocking passage. The deep trench already carved across the middle made it impossible for any car to pass, even if someone tried. Piles of dirt were stacked so high on the sides it looked like a wall. For the first time, Jake felt something cold settle in his gut. This wasn't just careless. This was dangerous. No one had received a notice. No email. No flyers. Nothing. Jake had checked the HOA's schedule plenty of times. There was no approved construction for the week. Yet here they were, digging like it was their personal property. He wasn't the only one who had noticed either. One by one, neighbors started stepping out of their houses in confusion, some still in pajamas, some with coffee mugs in hand, blinking against the sunlight and noise. They whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Mrs. Hall from across the street hugged her robe around herself and muttered, "What on earth are they doing?" Another neighbor said, "I have work at 8. How am I supposed to get out?" Someone else added, "Did anyone even tell us about this?" Karen ignored them. She pretended their voices didn't exist, walking around like the street belonged to her. She had always been like this, loud, proud, and too sure of herself. Whenever she made a decision, she didn't ask anyone. She didn't warn anyone. She just acted. It was her way of showing power. And right now, she was acting like ripping open the only road in the neighborhood was a stroke of genius. Jake crossed the lawn and walked up to the edge of the trench, his arms folded. "Karen," he called over the sound of the machines. She didn't look at him at first, but when he didn't move, she turned with that smug smile she always wore when she thought she was untouchable. "Morning, Jake," she said like everything was perfectly normal. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Road repairs," she said, raising her chin slightly. "Long overdue, by the way." "You're blocking the only way in or out," he said. She shrugged like it meant nothing. "It's just for a day. It's for the good of the community. You'll survive." She turned back to the workers like the conversation was over. Jake stared at the trench, at the deep gash in the street, and felt that quiet, controlled anger grow in his chest. She wasn't even trying to hide her arrogance. She never did. She didn't care about the fact that people had jobs, appointments, emergencies, lives. She just wanted to look like the one who got things done. More neighbors gathered now, some calling out questions to Karen, others whispering to each other nervously. Someone pointed at the trench and said, "What if an ambulance needs to get through?" Another added, "We don't even have a side road." A man in a delivery uniform stood at the end of the block with a confused look on his face, unable to get through with his truck. But Karen, standing in the middle like a general on a battlefield, didn't care. She just waved her hand and said, "It's just one day. Relax. You people complain too much." Jake noticed the workers didn't even have proper signs up. No reflective cones. No warning tape. Nothing to guide someone who might come down the hill fast. All it would take was one accident, one emergency, one unlucky moment, and this road work would turn into something much worse. And Karen, arrogant, careless Karen, would pretend it wasn't her fault. She always did. He walked a little closer, the smell of fresh asphalt and diesel burning in the air, the sound of drills echoing down the street like thunder. "This is reckless," he said. "You can't just tear up the street without a plan." She didn't even bother turning fully toward him this time. "I can and I did," she said sharply. "It's for the better. If you don't like it, take it up at the next board meeting." She flashed a grin like she had already won. Jake knew that grin well. It was the same grin she wore when she fined people for things that weren't against the rules, when she shut down neighborhood events because she didn't control them, when she bullied her way through votes. The morning wore on, and the trench got deeper. The piles of dirt grew taller, and the sound of machinery grew louder. Kids peered through windows. Parents made frustrated phone calls. Delivery vans turned around in frustration. But Karen just stood there, clipboard in hand, drinking her coffee and barking at the crew to work faster. She was proud of herself. She thought this was leadership. But Jake felt that uneasy knot in his stomach grow tighter with every passing hour. This wasn't just some minor inconvenience. Blocking this road meant something serious could happen, and when it did, no one would be able to help. Ambulances wouldn't get through. Fire trucks wouldn't get through. If anything happened, they'd all be trapped. He walked back toward his house, but he kept watching. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, the kind that ignored consequences until it was too late. She thought this was just a simple project. She thought she had everything under control. But she had no idea how fast a situation like this could turn into a disaster. The sound of another truck backing up echoed across the block, workers shouting as they unloaded more pipes. Karen smiled proudly, like she had built an empire. But Jake saw it for what it was, a trap waiting to be sprung. She thought this was just road work. But she didn't see what was coming. He didn't know when it would happen, or how, but he could feel it deep down like a storm building on a clear horizon. Something was going to go wrong. It wasn't a question of if. It was only a question of when. By noon the situation on the street had gone from noisy to a complete mess. The air thick with the smell of diesel, wet dirt, and frustration. Jake leaned against his fence watching the HOA crew dig deeper trenches like they were preparing for war, not road repair. Trucks were parked at both ends of the block, workers shouting instructions over the noise of jackhammers and machines. The single road out of the neighborhood now looked like someone had split it in half with a giant knife. There was no way in or out, no detour, no plan. He wasn't the only one who noticed the danger anymore. Neighbors were gathering in small, tense groups, pointing at the massive holes and the dirt walls rising around them. The trench was now so deep that even a large truck couldn't drive across it. People who had morning appointments were stuck. Delivery vans had turned back. One woman missed a doctor's visit. A man yelled across the street asking how they were supposed to leave if someone got sick. And through all of it, Karen stood in the center, smiling like she had just done something brilliant. She walked around with her clipboard, acting like a project manager, nodding at workers, giving instructions she barely understood. She didn't care about traffic, didn't care about safety, didn't even care about the growing anger in her neighbors' voices. In her mind, this was a perfect power move. She wanted everyone to see that she was fixing the neighborhood. Jake knew her game. She didn't do things for the community. She did them to remind people she was in charge. She loved that power, loved the feeling of making decisions without asking anyone's permission. But today, she had gone too far. A neighbor named Tom tried to drive out earlier. His truck barely made it a few feet before he had to stop at the wall of dirt. He shouted at the crew to move something, anything, but they just shrugged and pointed toward Karen. She walked over, arms crossed, wearing that fake polite smile she always used when she was about to dismiss someone. "It's just for the day," she said. "Can't you wait? We're improving the neighborhood." Tom slammed his truck door and walked away, cursing under his breath. Another neighbor, an older woman, asked what would happen if an ambulance needed to get through. Karen laughed it off, said, "Nothing's going to happen. It's just one day." That sentence sent a chill down Jake's spine. Nothing ever happens, until it does. The sound of the jackhammer echoed through the houses like a warning. Jake watched a worker drag a thick metal pipe across the trench, shouting for someone to secure it. A few kids on bikes stopped at the corner, staring at the torn-up street with wide eyes. Their parents yelled for them to stay away. There were no safety barriers around the deeper sections. If someone slipped in there, they wouldn't climb out easily. Jake clenched his jaw as he watched. Karen had turned their quiet street into a trap, and she didn't even realize it. He walked toward her, hands in his jacket pockets, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. "You need to open a lane," he said. "At least one path for cars." She raised an eyebrow, tilting her head like she was amused. "Why?" she asked. "It's fine. The work will be done by tonight. Nobody needs to drive anywhere." Her confidence was like a wall. It didn't matter what anyone said. She believed she was untouchable. "This is the only emergency road," Jake said, his voice lower now. "If something happens, no one can get in or out." She rolled her eyes, waved her hand, and turned away to yell at a worker to dig faster. That was her answer. By mid-afternoon, frustration turned into shouting. One neighbor demanded to know why the board hadn't sent a notice. Another argued that this kind of work needed a county permit. Karen brushed them all off with the same smug smile. "It's approved," she kept saying. But Jake had checked the county website the night before. No permits had been issued for road work in this area. She was lying. She was always good at lying, wrapping her words in confident tones so people doubted themselves. But not this time. The evidence was right in front of everyone. Trucks trapped. Cars stranded. People late for work. Kids stuck inside. No one could pretend this was fine anymore. Even the workers were starting to look uneasy. One of them walked up to Karen and said something about needing to move equipment before nightfall. She snapped at him to keep going. She didn't care about logistics. She only cared about being seen as in charge. But Jake's mind wasn't focused on her ego. He was watching the road itself, the way the trench was spreading wider and deeper. It was blocking everything now. Even if they wanted to make a quick escape, they couldn't. The real problem wasn't just the road being closed. The real problem was the kind of neighborhood this was. The houses were built on a hill with one entrance. If anything happened, a fire, a medical emergency, even something as simple as a gas leak, no emergency vehicles would make it through. Jake had seen the fire truck struggle to navigate even during winter snow. With the road torn in half like this, they wouldn't stand a chance. And Karen, in her usual arrogance, didn't even realize how close she was to creating a real disaster. A cold breeze passed through the street as the afternoon shadows grew longer. The air smelled of broken pavement and dust. Jake looked down the road at the unfinished trench and felt a familiar weight in his chest. He'd been warning her for months that something like this would happen. She never listened. She always thought the rules didn't apply to her. But roads don't care about ego. Emergencies don't wait for people to be ready. He walked back toward his house, the sound of construction roaring behind him, neighbors still arguing, Karen still smirking. She thought this was just road work. She thought she could dig up the street, shrug, and walk away like she always did. But she didn't see the storm building on the horizon. And Jake, staring at the trench under the fading light, knew something was coming. It was no longer just about inconvenience. It was about how fast everything could go wrong when arrogance blocked the only way out. The sky was turning gold when the sound hit, long, sharp, and unmistakable. Sirens. It started faint, way down the hill beyond the neighborhood, but it grew louder, closer, faster. Jake froze where he stood on his porch. The trench stretched across the road like an open wound. Machines parked carelessly at both ends, the entire street cut off. And now those sirens, slicing through the evening air like a blade. A bad feeling gripped him low in the chest. He turned his head toward the sound, and before he even saw the flashing lights, he knew this was the moment everything Karen had ignored was about to hit her like a wall. Neighbors stepped out of their houses, confused, some shading their eyes against the setting sun. "Is that an ambulance?" someone shouted. But a second later, the deeper, louder wail joined in. It wasn't just an ambulance. It was fire trucks. Two big red engines came tearing around the corner at the bottom of the hill, lights flashing, sirens screaming. Then, they stopped. Just like Jake knew they would. The giant trench that Karen's crew had dug up like it was nothing was now a solid barrier. There was no way through. The fire trucks sat at the edge of the torn-up road, engines rumbling, trapped. Karen came rushing out from where she had been talking to one of the workers, clipboard still in hand like it meant anything now. She stared at the scene with wide eyes, blinking like she didn't understand what she was seeing. "What's happening?" she shouted. One of the neighbors pointed down the street where a thick column of black smoke was rising into the sky, curling slowly like a warning. A house at the far end of the neighborhood was burning. Not just smoke. Fire. Real fire. Someone yelled, "It's the Miller place," and panic rippled through the crowd like lightning. The firefighters jumped out of their trucks, shouting orders, boots slamming the pavement. "We need access," one of them yelled at the workers. "Move this equipment." But the workers just stood frozen, looking at the deep trench they had carved. There was no way to move the machines fast enough. No way to fill the road. The fire truck couldn't drive through, and the second truck had blocked the back entrance. They were stuck. The firefighters ran up, scanning the scene like trained soldiers in a war zone. But it didn't take a genius to see the problem. The only emergency road in the neighborhood was destroyed. Karen took a shaky step forward, her mouth opening but no words coming out. For the first time all day, she wasn't smirking. She wasn't acting like a queen. She was pale, silent, powerless. Jake stepped closer to the street, watching the firefighters quickly unroll hoses, shouting to each other. They had to find another way in. One climbed over the dirt pile, looking toward the burning house. Another kicked at the ground in frustration. "We can't get the truck through," one yelled. A neighbor ran toward them screaming that there were kids inside. The panic hit everyone at once. Karen's voice finally cracked through the noise. I didn't know," she stammered, but no one listened. The sheriff's vehicle screeched to a stop behind the fire trucks, and two deputies jumped out. One of them immediately started waving people back while the other walked straight up to Karen with a look on his face that wasn't angry. It was cold. "What happened here?" he barked. Karen tried to talk, but her words stumbled over themselves. "We were just fixing the road," she said weakly. The deputy's jaw clenched. "You blocked an emergency route," he said flatly. "You trapped the fire crews." Meanwhile, the firefighters dragged hoses over fences, through yards, across flower beds. Neighbors grabbed buckets, trying to help however they could. But every second they wasted fighting the trench was another second the fire grew. Smoke rolled across the neighborhood, thick and choking. You could hear the faint sound of something collapsing in the distance. A roof beam or a porch, Jake couldn't tell. Someone was crying on their lawn. Karen stumbled closer to the trench like she thought if she stared at it long enough, it might magically disappear. Her perfect little one-day project had turned into a wall between help and disaster. One of the fire captains pointed directly at her. "Who authorized this?" he shouted over the noise. She froze, shaking her head like a cornered animal. I'm with the HOA, she managed to say. "We thought it would be fine." The captain's face darkened. "Fine? You've cost us minutes we don't have." His voice wasn't a shout. It was a hard, sharp knife of truth. Jake stood a few feet back, watching the chaos unravel exactly the way he had feared. He wasn't smiling. There was nothing to smile about. But the cold, heavy truth hung over the street like smoke. He had warned her. Everyone had. And she hadn't cared. Now the fire crews were climbing fences, struggling with hoses, trying to work around a disaster that never should have existed. Neighbors surrounded Karen now, voices rising. "You did this," one man shouted. "You blocked the road," another yelled. A woman cried, "My sister lives 2 houses from there." Karen tried to speak, tried to blame the contractor, tried to say it wasn't her fault. But every word she spoke sounded smaller, weaker, and the sound of the fire trucks idling uselessly behind the trench drowned her out. Up the hill, the orange glow of the burning house painted the night sky. The sirens didn't sound like hope anymore. They sounded like a reminder of how fragile everything was when one arrogant decision cut off their lifeline. The fire captain ordered his team to break a fence and cut across 3 backyards. The hoses finally reached the house, but the delay had already done damage. Jake stared at Karen, who now stood shaking, her precious clipboard slipping from her hands into the dirt. Her voice was gone. Her power was gone. She had finally realized what everyone else already knew. Leadership isn't about control, it's about responsibility. And tonight, her mistake had trapped an entire neighborhood. And the sirens kept wailing. The fire burned for nearly an hour before the last ember was smothered. The glow that once lit the end of the street now just smoke curling into the dark sky. The air thick with ash and wet pavement. Neighbors standing outside in silence, faces streaked with shock and exhaustion. The firefighters had fought like hell, running hoses across fences, cutting through backyards, even breaking down a section of a neighbor's fence to make a path. But the truth was written on every face. They could have saved that house faster if the road hadn't been blocked. And everyone knew exactly who had caused it. Karen stood near the trench with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her fancy jacket smeared with dirt, her face pale and hollow. The clipboard that she'd proudly carried around all morning lay somewhere in the mud, forgotten. She wasn't shouting now. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't giving orders. She was staring at the burned house at the end of the street like she was trying to rewind time. But time didn't care about excuses. It didn't care about just one day or I didn't think anything would happen. The fire had shown the neighborhood what her arrogance really cost. The fire captain walked toward her slowly, his boots leaving black prints on the wet ground, his helmet tucked under his arm. His face was calm, but there was no kindness in it. He stopped in front of her, his voice low but cutting through the night like a blade. This, he said, pointing back toward the charred remains of the house, didn't have to happen this way. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He leaned closer, his voice sharper now. We lost time we couldn't afford. Do you understand what that means? She nodded weakly, tears pooling in her eyes, but it was far too late for that to matter. Behind them, the sheriff's truck pulled in, the flashing lights washing over the ruined road. The deputies stepped out and began taking statements, speaking with firefighters, neighbors, and contractors. When the sheriff himself approached, his expression wasn't angry, it was worse. It was disappointed and cold. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. The broken road, the burnt house, and the silent crowd were louder than any words could ever be. He stopped a few feet from Karen and said flatly, "You blocked a designated emergency access. That's a violation of county safety codes." She blinked rapidly, shaking her head like she wanted to argue but couldn't find a single word to stand on. Jake stood off to the side with his arms crossed, watching the whole scene unfold. He hadn't gloated once. He hadn't said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The blackened roof at the end of the street said it for him. For weeks, he had warned her that blocking the only road was dangerous, but she'd waved him off like he was just another complainer. Now, the whole neighborhood saw the truth. She wasn't a leader. She was a liability. The sheriff continued talking, his voice firm and steady, making sure every word hit her like a hammer. You bypassed permits. You ignored safety rules. You gave no notice to residents or emergency services. And because of that, fire trucks couldn't get through when they were needed most. Karen trembled where she stood, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of what she'd done finally pressed down on her chest. She whispered something weak about trying to fix the road, but the sheriff cut her off before she could finish. You don't fix a road by putting lives at risk, he said sharply. Around them, neighbors whispered angrily. Some glared at her openly. Some just shook their heads. One woman stepped forward, tears still streaking down her cheeks, and shouted, "My niece lives in that house. She could have died because of you." Karen flinched like the words hit her physically. Another neighbor muttered, "She never listens to anyone." A man in a work jacket added, "She thinks she's the boss of everything. Look what it got us." The crowd wasn't just upset. They were done with her. The HOA board members who had backed Karen earlier in the day stood behind her now, silent, their faces drained of the false confidence they'd carried that morning. No one wanted to speak. No one wanted to share the blame. It was like watching a kingdom fall in slow motion. The county inspector arrived shortly after, taking photos of the torn-up road, the trench, the equipment. When he heard there were no permits, his expression turned hard. He informed Karen that not only was the construction illegal, but blocking an emergency access road was a serious offense. The words fines, investigation, and personal liability hung in the cold air like heavy stones. Karen staggered back a little when she heard that, her knees almost buckling. For the first time since Jake had known her, the woman who loved control more than anything looked small. The firefighters began rolling up their hoses, packing equipment back into the trucks, their faces tired and grim. As one of them walked past Karen, he didn't even look at her. But his silence was louder than anger. They had done their job despite her mistake, not because of her. The smell of wet ash and burned wood filled the street, the black skeleton of the house at the end of the road standing like a monument to her failure. Jake slowly walked toward the sheriff, who was finishing up with the inspector. The sheriff gave Jake a look that said everything without needing words. Then he turned back to Karen. "You're going to answer for this," he said quietly but firmly. Karen just nodded, her eyes glassy, hands shaking. She wasn't the HOA queen anymore. She was just a woman who made a selfish choice and burned her reputation down with someone else's home. Neighbors started heading inside, their conversations low and bitter. Some stopped to look at the trench one more time, their faces tight with anger. Everyone would remember this night. Not because of the fire, but because when help tried to come, it couldn't. Jake lingered at the edge of the road, the flashing red and blue lights washing over his face, his hands resting in his jacket pockets. The fire had shown everyone what he already knew. Power doesn't make someone a leader. Responsibility does. And Karen had none. She had torn up the only road, ignored every warning, and now the whole neighborhood had paid the price. She thought it was just road work. She thought nothing could go wrong. But the sirens proved her wrong. And now, with the street broken and the fire crews packing up, her little empire had cracked like the asphalt under her boots.